I'm going to have to read this. I don't have it memorized. In his farewell address as president, Dwight Eisenhower warned, quote, "We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex." He also cautioned, quote, that in the councils of government we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the defense industry. So the question for our panelists is, have we heeded President Eisenhower's warning, or has the defense industry gained too much power and influence?
I think all special interests have gained way too much power and influence. The bottom line is, for years we've treated the Constitution like a menu. Me and Joe got elected by 83 votes based in large part of constitutional violations that Rob Simmons enabled and George Bush engaged in. And at the end of the day, it took Democrats to give George Bush way more than he even asked for. So we still have, you know, things like the Patriot Act. I mean, it took forever to do something about warrantless spying. I mean, the concept that, you know, the Constitution is suddenly optional, we should really do away with that. And if the bottom line is, the Constitution is a restriction on what the federal government can't do. And if you can't do it, don't do it. And that's the only way to address the problem. But if we don't address the problem, we're going to go beyond $20 trillion in debt, and it's going to be a lot worse very quickly.
Representative Courtney, the defense contractors are among your biggest contributors. Is the defense industry getting undue power over our political process?
So I actually agree with Dan a little bit in terms of his comment that you know, part of the problem with Washington, and I see it every single day, is the fact that we have a system of financing campaigns which, again, distorts, I think, doesn't go to the extreme that I think Dan says, but it definitely distorts the electoral process. And it is time for the people of this country to take it back. There is legislation that my good friend John Sarbanes from Maryland, Government by the People Act, which has about 145 co-sponsors, which would decouple elections, congressional elections, from large contributions and super PACs, et cetera. And I think that that would go a long way to, I think, restoring the balance of people's confidence in the system, which again I think is very much in doubt, and you can see it in the primaries and the you know, the public opinion polls, that people really do have sort of a crisis of faith in terms of the government. But the Government by the People Act is something that's been endorsed by environmental groups, civil rights groups, as well as good government groups as really the best step forward.
Thank you. Ms. Novak, your reaction to that comment that was made by a very popular Republican president?
I do have a reaction. I would encourage everybody, go out to Vote Smart or one of these sites and look at the donors to Joe Courtney's campaign. They are all the big defense contractors. There's numerous ones. When you have special interest money in an election, the person in that is under undue influence as far as I'm concerned. I have stated to anyone that's donated to my campaign, they don't owe me. They don't owe me at all. We can't have that. Now, when it comes to the defense budget, we are no longer in a post-Cold War period where the spending levels need to be low. We actually need to look at the situation today where we are in more critical situation with Middle East, with Asia, with Russia. We've got to make sure that our men and women have everything that they need to do their jobs. That requires spending money. I want to make sure our nation is safe without due influence from any individual contractors.
Mr. Pelto?
The idea that the defense budget is a sacred cow and that criticism of wasteful and fraudulent spending is somehow un-American is a dangerous reference to exactly the kind of thing that President Eisenhower was warning us about. Here we are 56 years later, and the military-industrial complex has undermined our financial stability, has created the largest debtor nation in the world, that we have 50% of our entire budget, discretionary budget, is spent on defense. The Green Party has proposed that we reduce defense spending by 50%, which still would make us spend more than any other country in the world, and that we find those savings through getting rid of the wasteful programs like the aircraft carrier that's costing $13 billion, the Ford series that won't even be able to be used because they can't get the planes on correctly, they can't be used correctly, and it can't defend itself if attacked. And so I would say say that it's time to cut the defense budget, to use those funds for other things, and to go ahead and recognize that President Eisenhower was warning us of something that we need to address more than ever before.
Let's hear Representative Courtney first, and we'll go to Mr. Reale, because the issue was raised by Ms. Novak about the campaign donations you receive and the influence that might curtail.
So again, we live in a district that is the second in the country in terms of shipbuilding. According to the American Shipbuilding Association, we have a submarine base that is celebrating its 100th anniversary. We have, again, a lot of people who are actively engaged in that part of our country's economy, and that's who I represent, and I am very proud to represent them, and a lot of them support me and support the work that I do. On the Armed Services Committee, we have made reductions in different programs, and I've been part of coalitions that have tried to do more in terms of restricting some of the platforms that come through our committee. I've actually voted with Ranking Member Smith against President Obama on the nuclear-tipped medium-range missiles, which is a bad program, and that we should not go down that path.
I'm going to have to close it there. Mr. Reale, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, it's gotten so absurd that just recently the Chicago Tribune came out with an article covering the fact that CIA trained and funded and armed people in Syria were shooting at Pentagon trained, armed, and funded people. Now, we also have a situation, I never thought I'd see the day where John McCain would complain on the Senate floor that we were bombing Al-Qaeda. I was beside myself when that happened a few years ago. So we've got a problem here, and I think the 2nd District needs a steward who's actually going to use impeachment.
All right, thank you. Next question is to you, Mr. Courtney.